Our speaker today is Meredith Larson, and we're so happy to have her return to the Plain community. Dr. Meredith Larson is a program officer in the National Center for Education Research at the Institute of Education Science, U.S. Department of Education. Meredith oversees research grants on post-secondary and adult education and education research training grants. Her background is in cognitive psychology and psycholinguistics. She has taught post-secondary English language courses, college writing, and prescriptive grammar, and she has published work on experimental pragmatics, semantics, and syntax. Meredith earned a master's degree in English and cognitive and instructional psychology from Northern Illinois University and a doctorate degree in linguistics from Northwestern University. And we are all agog to hear what she has to say. So Meredith, over to you.
Thank you. So just a quick sound check. Can somebody confirm that you can hear me?
Yes.
All right, good. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for taking time out of your very busy day. I'm not going to spend a lot of time introducing myself because that was a truthful introduction. And I want to just take a moment to thank you all for what you do. Writing is very hard. Communicating with the public is very hard. And if COVID-19 has taught us nothing else, it's taught us how important your work is and how difficult it is. There's a lot of information coming at us. It is complex. It is changing. And your ability to communicate even other things like how to submit tax forms is important to people's real lives. And it's difficult to do. So how can we help do our jobs better? Sadly, the average American reader probably needs us as writers to do even more than what we're already doing. We're trying to meet their needs, but we're probably not meeting everybody's needs, in part because we're not fully aware of where they are coming from, how they're understanding what we're writing, and how they're using what we're making available to them. So the first part of my presentation today, I'm going to look at some of the information and the data that we have about adult skills. These data come from an international survey, and some of you may already be aware of this survey. But if you are not, it is called the PIAC, or the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. This was a large international assessment that surveyed adults 16 to 65 across a number of OECD countries. So these are the other sort of advanced countries and economies across the world. There were two major components. One was a direct assessment of 3 skill areas: literacy, numeracy, and problem solving using technology, which I'm just going to call digital problem solving. And then there was a rich background questionnaire that got information about the participants' education, self-reported health and civic participation, self-reports of the skills they used at work and at home, and some other demographic information. So the PIAC, when it assessed those 3 skill areas, literacy, numeracy, and digital problem solving, was really trying to think in terms of real-world uses. The idea was to figure out not, if somebody could analyze Shakespeare or do calculus, but were they prepared to engage in a modern society? Were they prepared for the workforce? Were they prepared for democracies? And so just to give you an example, here is the definition they used for the literacy construct. And the basic definition is that literacy is somebody's ability to understand, evaluate, use, and engage with written text to participate in society, to achieve their goals, and to develop their knowledge and potential. The same sort of definition is true for the numeracy and also the problem solving. Important for this conversation is understanding sort of the scales that the PIAC used. The literacy and numeracy scales had 5 sort of brackets. And you can go over these slides and read the definitions in greater detail in the future. What I want to point out to you now is that when they were creating this assessment, the general idea was that somebody, and I'm not sure, oh, there we go, it is showing up on your screen. So somebody who's performing at level 3 would be considered sufficient. You know, they have the necessary skills to work, to vote, to engage in a modern society. People that score at level 1 or below, we will consider at risk. Okay, so these aren't the official definitions. This is just how we're going to talk about it. And adults that perform at level 2 are still not proficient, but they're not necessarily at significant risk, but they're definitely struggling. Okay, so for literacy and numeracy, if you scored at a level 3 or above, we're going to say that you're proficient, you're okay. If you score at level 2 or below, you're struggling or at risk, and you might need a little bit more support from the information that you're trying to process. In digital problem solving, there was a 3-point scale, and you could also perform it below level 1, so sort of a level 0. And again, the tasks that were being measured were supposed to be sort of real-world, everyday tasks. You want to keep in mind that not every adult was able to even take this test. So if you didn't know how to use a computer or a mouse, you would get the assessment on paper. If you could pass that basic screening and you knew how to use a mouse or a tablet, then you might be taking the digital problem solving part of the assessment. And here's some examples of what might be a level 0, 1, 2, or 3 problem. For the purposes of conversation, in developing this, the assumption was that if you could perform a level 2 task, you're prepared to fully engage in modern society. So let's go ahead and take a look. I was asked by my colleagues at the National Center for Education Statistics, which is the branch of the Institute of Education Sciences that engaged in this survey and that gathered the data, to remind people that the full data are available online. And what I'm about to show you today, we used the 2012 and 2014 data that we collected to create this story. So it's based on the publicly available data, but it is not from the official reports, which you can find online. There are also data that were collected in 2017. They were not available when we were compiling the data for this presentation, but there are new results, and those results are very much in keeping with the story I'm about to tell you. So, I've given you a lot of information. I've told you that a level 3 in literacy and numeracy is considered proficient. I've told you like all these things, but what does that actually mean? What does it look like? You know, how can we write for a level 3? What does that even mean? So I want to take a little pause here and look at a few examples of the types of items the participants would get. The first one we're going to look at is from the literacy. So here is an example, and for those of you who know plain language, you're probably looking at this and thinking, hey, you know, this follows plain language principles. It's got a clear title that sets up the context. It's got declared sentences. It's bullet pointed, simple layout. This looks pretty darn good. This here is a level 2 question. Okay, so this is that, like if you can perform this reliably, you're probably a level 3 or above. So go ahead and take a second here, look at the rules, look at the question, see what you think the answer could be. So what % of U.S. adults do you think might struggle to answer this sort of question reliably? Survey says 52%. This means that the majority of people in the United States may struggle to determine exactly what time their child must be at preschool. If you look at the international average, the United States is about average. The interesting thing about the United States that we find in this survey, and pretty consistently, is that the United States tends to have a much larger portion of the population at the very low ends, and also a relatively large part at the very high ends for literacy. So we've got almost like two different worlds here of literacy, with some people really, really struggling and some people doing it quite well. So what about numeric information? Maybe we process that differently. Again, nowadays, especially with all this information that we're getting about the probability of getting sick and doing this and that and the other thing, being able to understand numeric information is extremely important. So here is an example, again, of a level 2 item. So this is for that sort of, like, if you don't get this one reliably, you're probably struggling or at risk. So go ahead and take a look at this. I'm going to take a little breath so you can read the question, come up with the answer, and then predict how the percentage of people that might struggle with this. And the survey says that roughly 62% of the U.S. population is likely to struggle with a question at this level of difficulty. Unlike literacy, the United States is definitely below the international average for performance on numeracy. For those of you who might be familiar with other international assessments, this is in keeping with what we have found for younger U.S. students. Numbers are hard for us. We're not even like getting into advanced algebra and calculus, just knowing how to work with numeric information is difficult for a significant portion of the adult population. So what about digital problem solving? Okay, I mean, I walk around, I know I'm always on my smartphone, I've got multiple computers and tablets, I see this around my environment. We've got millennials and younger adults that are all on their computers and laptops all the time. So how are we doing with digital problem solving? So here is a level 2 item. In this item, you are trying to return a lamp that you ordered from kelamps.com. It was the wrong color, and you have this website, and you must use the website to return and exchange your item. The assessment is looking not only at whether or not you solved the problem, but your path towards solving that problem. So again, sort of take a look at this, think about what you might do to get to the solution, and then predict the percent of the population that you think might struggle with this sort of question. Survey says 62%. So again, the majority of adults in the United States are likely to struggle to solve real-world problems using technology. Looking at our place internationally, we definitely have a larger portion of our population at the struggling and at-risk level relative to the international average. And in fact, if you look at where we rank, we were dead last for the 2012-2014 data in the line of the countries that actually took this part of the assessment. So what does this mean? right? Anybody who's ever taken an introduction to stats class should probably be sort of like scratching their head or looking a little side-eye because I've been giving averages here. And averages, they cover a lot, right? I mean, they don't tell you much about the actual individuals that may be struggling. So let's do a little bit deeper of a dive and really dig into some of the demographics, because one of the most important things we know about writing is to have some idea of your audience and who you might be writing for. And perhaps if the people you're writing for are more likely to be in that at-risk or struggling group, you'll do things differently. And if they're more likely to be in the proficient group, you can do different things. So if you have a better sense of who you're writing for, maybe you can put your resources and your energies in the right place, right? So in the next few slides, I'm going to set up a question about a demographic group, and then we're going to look at what the data suggests. So one thing that people might think is that age may matter. Okay, so there are older people in the population that maybe didn't have access to formal education, or maybe it's been a while since they've had to do some problem solving, or these are just kind of tasks that they're just out of practice with. So does age matter? The survey suggests no. The low skills are fairly evenly distributed across age groups. So it is not the fact that our younger population is getting better than their parents or grandparents. And this is, if you're an economist, this should be extremely concerning, right? The ideal is that each generation is better prepared than the generation before. Sadly, at least in literacy, this is not what we're finding. So in these slides, I'm using the literacy data, but to be honest, this is the same pattern you see across all domains. So it does not vary in numeracy by and large. Another question you may ask yourself is whether immigrant communities or potentially non-native speakers are sort of driving things that might be going on here, and whether, like if you're writing for native-born American populations, maybe this isn't going to be as significant of an issue. And again, the data suggests no. We cannot just assume that driving this low literacy rate are people who didn't have access to the U.S. system or for whom English may itself be difficult. In fact, 80% of adults that are in that struggling or at-risk group were born in the United States, meaning that they probably went through the U.S. education system. So another question that you might ask is whether employment matters, right? So I mean, if you're working, surely you've had more experience with technology. You're asked to be reading manuals and emails. And if you're unemployed, maybe you're not as practiced. So again, it is not the fact that people with low literacy are unemployed or out of the labor force. In fact, we find that the majority of people who are struggling or at risk for low literacy are actually employed, right? So next question. Okay, we know that it's not just a matter of age. It's not a matter of where you were born. It's not a matter of whether you're employed. Does education matter? As somebody who works for the U.S. Department of Education, I really hope it does. I should hope that the more education you get, the better your basic skills are. And in fact, the data do suggest that the more education you have, the better your literacy is likely to be. However, notice here that almost a quarter of people who have bachelor's degrees are performing at that struggling or at-risk level. So it is not the case that just because you are writing for somebody who's college educated, that they're going to be reading at that proficient level. There are people that you may have graduated college with that could be struggling to comprehend what you think is a fairly straightforward list of preschool rules. So let's kind of delve into a few more demographics. Does gender predict? Are women better readers than men? No. Women and men perform similarly, so I guess that's a good thing. This is an equal opportunity difficulty that we all face. Does race or ethnicity predict? And the answer here is yes. Actually, sometimes it does. Some race and ethnicities are more likely to have lower rates of literacy. In particular, African American, Black, and Hispanic communities tend to have higher incidences of lower literacy than other groups. Does region predict? And again, it kind of does. So here we see that the South has higher rates of lower literacy. So what does this mean for you as a writer? It means a few things. Number one, if you're writing within a community that might have more minorities, there might be a higher incidence of low literacy. However, everybody is struggling with this. If you're writing and really targeting communication to people who live in the South, yes, there might be more struggles with literacy. At the same time, it's represented across the United States. So I'm not done. there's more that can complicate how you're communicating. What do we know about skills and how they predict other behaviors that are relevant to what we're trying to do? Okay, so we as writers and communicators, we're trying to help people find information. Is somebody's basic skill a predictor of how they come to seek that information and how they consume it? And the answer is yes. Okay, so adults who have lower skills and who are older or have less education are less likely to find information online in particular and to benefit from it. So, just to kind of put this out there, what does that mean, right? What does that mean about what we're doing and how we're doing it? And it doesn't stop there. There are other things that the research has time and time again show correlate with low literacy. We find that low literacy correlates with poor self-reported health. People with low skills are less likely to volunteer. They're less likely to believe that their participation matters, and they're less likely to trust others. So, just to put it out there, I wonder if this might affect readers. Probably, especially if you work for a government agency. If they don't feel that they matter in terms of political self-efficacy, how much are they going to trust us? How much are they going to come and seek us out? It is just another barrier that we find when we're trying to communicate. So how many Americans are we actually talking about here? Just to kind of give you sort of a ballpark, we're talking about approximately 113 million adults are at or below level 2 in literacy. Of these approximately 113, 40 million are at that at-risk level, right? So this is a large portion. I think at one point I calculated that it's basically the Great Lakes region, right? If you took the sort of 3 or 4 states kind of right around the Great Lakes, it's as though that is the population that we're talking about that are at risk and struggling. So a quick summary. We know that the majority of U.S. adults may struggle with reading comprehension, using numeric information, performing tasks with digital tools such as websites, software applications, and etc. So whenever you think about your audience, you should assume that what you might normally produce and think is okay could very well be too difficult for half of the people you're trying to reach. So can research point towards better practices? Are there things that we can be doing to make things better for people? Yes, I hope so. So let's kind of look at what the research is suggesting about adults, and then we'll try to leverage this and think about what this can mean for the way we communicate. So here are some findings from the research. First, adults are more likely to rely on world knowledge. Okay, we bring a lot into the reading context. We have lived lives, we've survived, we know what things should mean, and that is both a help and a hindrance. Okay, so adults are more likely to sort of struggle with new words and sounding them out, especially native speakers of English. Non-native speakers are actually a little bit better at sounding out new words. Adults with low literacy are also not fluent readers. Okay, so they don't necessarily understand what a comma is supposed to mean or what a period means in terms of pausing, wrapping up, and getting that intonational pattern that conveys so much information. Adults with low literacy might notice oddities or inconsistencies within a text. So if there's a word that, kind of seems really strange, or, a sentence that kind of garden paths and you're confused about the syntax of it, a skilled reader will catch that, sort of scratch their head, and engage in what are called repair strategies. So they might go back and they may reread, they may really sort of kind of delve into things. Adults with low skills, they just keep going, right? Or their eyes kind of skim around and they don't seem to really repair things in the same way a more skilled reader would. Adults with low literacy are also going to struggle with pronominal reference. So if you use things, and here's a classic example. The thief watched the house from across the street. The family had gone to Florida for the weekend. The robber crept closer to the door. For a skilled reader with a literary background, the thief and the robber are the same person. For somebody who is less experienced, those are very likely to be two people. So anytime you have a pronoun or you're changing noun phrases, you're likely to be losing some of your readers. Adults with low literacy may also be more likely to experience cognitive overload, so the sheer appearance of text on a page can be overwhelming. They are also more likely to have problems navigating multiple pages. And they're likely to struggle with meta-comprehension, which is your awareness of how well you're understanding. They're likely to be overconfident and think that they're actually understanding more than they are. However, this is not unique. This is a pretty ubiquitous thing. Most people think that they understand way more than they do. So what does reading a website actually look like? So on this slide, we have some eye tracking data. And here, and this is from a book, and let's see if I can get, oh, that didn't come up. The reference isn't showing up on one of my screens, but it's showing up on the other. So on this, we see what an eye gaze pattern looks like for a skilled reader. So the skilled reader is looking through, sort of hopping around, but getting to the main points and finding the information that's relevant. Here's what an unskilled reader or somebody who's struggling or might have low literacy is doing. So here we see eye gaze patterns where the person is spending a lot of time looking at things that are not necessarily relevant, spending a lot of time plowing through sentences, going back, skipping around a lot, and it doesn't seem appropriate or systematic. And it's clear that this person is not moving through the text as easily as the first reader. So what if you make things look easier? This is a pretty dense text underneath all these orange dots of eye gazes. So if we make a more simplified text, perhaps it's easier. Yes. So in this, we see that the reader is coming in and is really looking through those bullet pointed things. However, the problem with this page is that those bullet points are not actually the most important information. The most important information is in that good news area, which is over sort of in the far right column. The reader is not actually spending as much time with what the writer actually thought was the takeaway message. So the less skilled reader is trying to avoid that cognitive load by looking at the more simple things and is probably actually getting lost in the organization of the text. So just one more comparison for you. So, and thinking about what you can do. We know that the low-skilled readers are going to struggle with new words, they're going to struggle with layouts, they're going to have cognitive overload. Are there ways that you can design your page and your information to make it simpler for them to find what they need? And the answer is yes. So here in this we see on the left a more complex layout with multiple columns, a lot of words, and the reader is spending a great deal of time and seems to be sort of distracted by things. And now compare that to the picture on the right, where you have a more simplified layout, so just one main column. And it looks like the information is organized in a way that really draws the reader to the most important things and supports the reader in focusing on them. So what are some specific things that you can try? Okay, so we're going to do some of the try this, not that. And a lot of these things that I'm about to say are going to feel like principles that you held near and dear to your heart. So they're going to resonate with you. It's just now you need to take it that extra mile. So, like you thought that it was good enough to put in bullets. It's like you need to think about that even more, right? So the first thing to keep in mind is keep it simple and convenient. Okay, so use short, common, highly predictable sentence structures. Use common words. Use rhetorical markers that are simple and straightforward. Use in-text supports, but you want to be cautious with that. Like if there's, because remember, some of the people are going to struggle if you have like a lot of hyperlinks. If they're low in digital literacy, they're not going to know how to use those hyperlinks. You also don't want them going to a gazillion pages when the information should be convenient. It should be right there on the same page whenever possible. If you provide sound files that read the text, this will help a lot of the population. You just kind of want to be making sure that the prosody doesn't mislead, right? So you want to make sure that the intonation curves, the pausing of sentences sounds fairly natural, or at least doesn't conflict with the rhetorical music of the language. The other thing to keep in mind is that layout matters. All right, so a lot of people have talked about the inverted pyramid, putting the most important things first. For your struggling and at-risk readers, assume that after the third or fourth sentence, they've got cognitive overload. So if you need them to know something to keep them safe or help them sort of with whatever task they're trying to achieve, that needs to be at the top. It needs to be clear. It needs to be straightforward. Bullets might actually help, right? Like it helps to focus attention. For skilled readers, periods, semicolons, those things are great. We love them. For less skilled readers, you can't rely on that being enough information for the people to know when to pause. And really sort of try to keep everything bite-sized and not require that people are pulling together multiple sources or multiple pages to find what they need. The other thing that you want to do, but also be cautious with, is activating that background knowledge, okay? Because as I said, adults will naturally be bringing in their life experience into this new reading task. But sometimes previous life experience is not helpful in the moment. Okay, so just because something would have worked last year doesn't mean that it is what we should be doing now. So if there is something that you're trying to convey to the public that might conflict with their normal assumptions or with their normal behaviors, you want to make that conflict apparent, and really sort of highlight, like, unlike most people think, X is true, right? Or just really make it clear that the background no longer applies. When you do activate background knowledge, you want to use titles and headers. Don't rely too much on pictures, especially if they have numeric information. And keep in mind that every picture is also a potential distraction. So it can feed into that cognitive overload. The other thing that is always great if you have time and you have the resources is to get reader feedback. And you want to survey a general population, not people that you work with, not people in your organization. Use open-ended questions and focus on knowledge checking. And this research, if you're kind of curious on how to do this, I'm sure advertisers know a lot about this as well. But within the health literacy research, there's been a lot of studies that look at how nurses and doctors talk differently to people with lower literacy and how they do less information checking and do more just sort of like regurgitation of, again, complex things. So to make sure that you're actually eliciting things, you want to do knowledge checks, you want to slow down, you want to be open-ended. So for those of you who are like me and need to sort of see an example of what this might look like, there are some resources currently. This is something from a group of researchers that I've been talking to. They are really interested in adults that read at the 3rd to 8th grade levels and immigrants. And they have recently taken charge on working on revising coronavirus materials. You can follow this link. You can look at how they're doing it to help their local population. Another thing that you might want to look at is this skills estimator. So this was just recently released. You can play around with it. You can look at different county level estimates and state level estimates to see sort of what that skill level is. So the website will allow you to look at that at or below level 1, which I said is sort of the at-risk group, the at level 2, which would be the struggling group, and the level 3 and above, which would be the proficient group. And you can look at people's literacy rates and their numeracy rates. And this might help you sort of predict if you're really trying to get information into a certain state or into a certain community, what is the percentage of people who might really need you to go above and beyond and go that extra mile? And with that, I believe we have some time for some questions. I know I ran through that, and I'm sure that there were questions along the way, so we can navigate back to certain slides if there are specific things there. And just in case you are curious, there is an additional slide here where there will be links to some of the things that I just brought up. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions.
Well, Meredith, again, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Brilliant presentation, as always. I'm trying to get through the chat to distinguish between comments and questions, so I'm trying to do that to, just as well as I can. Just to remind everyone, we will be posting the recording on DigitalGov, and we will be sending you the slides. If you haven't received the slides, please look in the chat. I've added the address, email them, they'll send them to you. So that is an excellent part. So that has been one of the bigger questions that we've had. So I wanted to make sure that I got through that. So let's see. We had a lot of people, yeah, a lot of people guessing on the numbers earlier when you were saying how many people do this. So, I'm very happy that, well, not happy that the numbers are high as they are, but people were having a lot of fun, I hope, guessing at the numbers.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I miss being able to watch people's faces and to hear their guesses. So
We'd have to unmute and just collectively gasp, but I think that
yeah,
would do it.
It would be chaos.
One question is, how do we cite the data?
Okay. So there, let's see if I can go back a few slides here for you. When you come, so there's a couple things here. You'll see at the bottom of this slide, there's a hyperlink to what's called the IDE. And this is a tool that anyone can use to explore any of the international data that we have collected, including the PIAC. So you can go in and make your own tables and start to adjust some of the values. There are some training materials, so if you wanted to replicate this, or if you had other specific questions, like if you wanted to do some deep dives into combinations of demographic groups to get information about the occupations that are represented, there's also self-reported information about income. So like if you wanted to get more of that information, you could create these tables yourselves. There's also, kind of getting back, sorry to have so many slides here. This website here, the PIAC data, will take you to some pre-published reports, some sort of short write-ups about particular subgroups or particular analyses, so you can cite those reports. There's also links to tables where we break things down. If people have any specific questions about tables that might already exist and how to cite them, you can shoot me an email and I might be able to find it for you, or I can find out who might know. Like I know that we created some tables that broke down to find information about the percentage of adults at these skill levels that were employed or unemployed, that had children or didn't have children, and also by the level of academic attainment. Another common question that we get is about income and occupation. And there's definitely research that has looked at that angle, and I don't know off the top of my head if there are pre-existing tables that break that down. I'm guessing there probably are, but I have not personally used them.
Okay, moving on to another question. What do you mean by at risk and by struggling?
Yes, so those are just organizational terms. They're not official. And we leverage those two terms because they come up a lot in policy and other discussions around education outcomes, where you have the at-risk group of learners being those that have the most significant level of needs and the most significant barriers, and the struggling students as being the group of students who still have barriers but are doing better. And then there's the sort of proficient. So one way to think about this is if you know anything about like post-secondary education, you could say that students that might be in developmental education are your struggling population, and students who really could not even get into college would be your at-risk.
Okay.
And I think that there was also a question about conflating of race and income. And like just knowing what we know about the correlation between race and between access and income and generational wealth, I am sure that there is a high correlation among many of these factors, and that family wealth and personal wealth are also good predictors of skill. I think one thing that the research from the first couple waves of the PAC suggested is that in the United States, there's what's called a 3-generation problem. So you can predict the basic skills and abilities of an individual on his or her grandparents' level of education. And so these, like the concerns that we're finding about people's abilities with literacy and numeracy are really symptomatic of generations of access, of generations of practice, support, or the lack thereof. So it is sort of a larger problem than just one person not being able to navigate a website. It's a systematic problem that's going to take a lot of effort for us to unpack. And just one other thing, so I mentioned that this is like 113 million people that we're talking about. We cannot expect the education system to come in and solve this. And we can't wait for the K-12 system to make it all go away. This is something that we as writers just need to be aware of, to do as much as we can to be supportive, and to collaborate to try and help bolster people's practice with literacy and numeracy, with finding information and evaluating it, and to build into our communication things that help build some of those skills as they go. And if you have somebody who might be struggling, trying to get him or her to places where they can help practice and build those skills.
Very good. Thank you. Another question is, we are seeing a number of people having problems using or knowing whether to use mobile menus, particularly the hamburger, that 3-line thing that indicates a menu. Are you seeing anything in the research for low literacy or low tech literacy usability?
This is an area of research that we're really hoping to develop. This, like when we talk about digital literacy, it's hard to even know what that means, but part of that is not only being able to comprehend like prose, but also understanding what these symbols are supposed to convey. And the fact of the matter is, like, people that are really skilled are the ones making up these new icons and getting bored with the old ones and replacing them before everybody has reached the same level of proficiency. My gut tells me, given what I have seen from these results and from other studies, that the hamburger is probably just meaningless to a large portion of the population. Just to give you sort of a sort of way to frame this, the Barbara Bush Foundation and the X Prize had a big competition where you're supposed to make a mobile app to help adults at that pre-literacy phase. And the adults, you had many, many teams making all these things, working with the population, creating these great apps that were supposed to be very sort of simple and straightforward. And one of the major barriers for the adults was even downloading and opening apps. And if they could get the app open, they would keep complaining that the app was crashing, when in fact they were hitting a button that to the developers seemed clearly to convey close app, but to them had no meaning at all. So there's not sufficient research, in my opinion, to really determine how novices or people with low literacy skills are interpreting icons. We need that research. But my gut tells me is that we're changing too fast, and people still haven't fully learned what an FAQ or what a question mark is supposed to mean. So the hamburger menu is probably like that's level 3. That's level, that's the high level, highly proficient people. understand what a hamburger is.
What differences do you see in attention span across groups? How much time will they spend trying to comprehend a web page, and for example, if it's on a mobile device, versus printed material like, a letter or a brochure?
Mm-hmm. I can't say definitively. I remember seeing some studies, and one of the differences here is also there are some differences in terms of like age and sort of tech comfort in whether they have differences in the print material versus the online material. So it's hard for me to make a straightforward comparison of, this one's going to be better. It really sort of matters what you're doing, and what group you're trying to work with. In terms of sort of the amount of time a person is willing to engage with material, one of the things I know happens is this thing that I mentioned in passing of cognitive overload. So there's just a certain time where you might be reading the words and looking at them and your eyes are moving, but you've stopped processing things. Like your brain is just kind of maxed out.
Stop eavesdropping on me, Meredith.
I'm sorry.
Stop eavesdropping on me, Meredith. That's exactly, yeah.
It's called mind wandering. We all do it. And if you can catch yourself doing it and remember the last time you processed something, if you're a strong reader, you'll go back to that point and you'll pick up again. Weaker readers don't catch themselves mind wandering and don't have the same repair strategies. Lower skilled readers are more likely to reach that maximum much more quickly. Another thing that will reduce your cognitive load capacity is stress and anxiety. Okay, so again, sort of thinking about what we do when we're communicating, especially like important information for public health, public safety, access to money or jobs. When people come to us, they are already in a state of heightened anxiety. You layer onto that the fact that we represent government agencies, and again, there's another level of anxiety. So even your skilled readers are coming to us with a depleted amount of resources to devote to untangling a website or untangling a document and pulling out the information from that. So I would say even in the most ideal, like the research that we have access to, you're working in ideal settings, right, where it's low stakes, nobody's going to lose a job. So this is when people have the most resources to give and they're still struggling. So even if you start with that research, you could probably cut it in half and start there and still be losing a portion of the population much larger than what you're comfortable with.
Okay. How do you distinguish between poor digital literacy and poor web design?
Ooh.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm like, if anybody can figure that out, I think you could rule the world. And I think, one of the things that makes it especially hard for people that are doing web design is that there is no agreed upon measure of digital literacy and digital proficiency, right? It's like something that we all kind of know, like we can tell when people aren't really getting it, but it's really hard to identify growth in this area because it's so new and it's changing so fast, right? So I wish I had the answer there. We're working on it, and if anybody has anything to share, I would love to watch that presentation.
Great. Do you have an idea of what government websites are doing a good job adjusting to literacy?
No. I know that a lot of people are working on this. I believe the VA has done a lot of work, and I know that there's a lot of interest and there's a lot of commitment to this, and that people are getting creative. So I think that, by and large, the community is really trying to respond. So I kind of feel like I'm preaching to the choir right now, and it's not the writers who need this information as much as it is the people above them that need this sort of reality. I know people are working on it, but I can't, point to a particular agency and say they've figured it out right now. I think that there might have also been some questions about rhetorical markers and what I meant by that. Yeah. So rhetorical markers, by that I meant anything that would help a reader to understand where he or she is within the text, how to evaluate one piece of information relative to the next or to a previous piece of information. So things like, numbering. So the first thing you should know is blank. The next thing you should know, so that could be sort of a rhetorical marker. It tells you about the rhetorical structure of the text. Things like moreover, but consequently, like things that might sort of help you put two arguments in position to one another, whether one takes precedence or is a consequence of another. Those would also be rhetorical markers. And some of them are just going to be more familiar and more sort of easy to digest. It's not just a matter of like character length, it's also frequency within discourse. And then for anybody who's done discourse analysis, you can also think about frequency within genre of discourse that you have, right? Like if you're trying to take a conversational style, you might have more buts and ands. If it was a more formal style, you might have more howevers than buts. But in general, stick with the buts, not the howevers, whenever possible. I think there was also a question about why pictures may be distracting. So pictures, number one, when you see a picture, especially of a smiling face or a cute animal, your eye is naturally attracted to that. So when you use a picture, you assume that somebody's going to look at it. And if it isn't activating necessary and useful information, or if it doesn't help carry the message, you've now given up some of that cognitive load, some of that energy to that picture. The other thing to keep in mind with pictures, especially if they're trying to convey numeric information, is that that picture alone may not actually meet the needs of the message, right? So I personally like pictures. I use them. But, I also am wary of putting too much into them or having too many, right? So you just kind of want to keep that balance.
Okay, I wanted to let you know that I will go through the chat, Meredith, and email you any further questions if you want to, add to the list and, add to the community and say, by the way, here was something that I didn't get to answer because there was so many questions for that. And although there was one that I can see right now, which is, have you done SEO research, search engine optimization research, to help match up low literacy people and what they search for and what information they find, if that makes sense? I was paraphrasing.
I love that idea. I have not had anything like that come across my desk. But I think that sort of work that is informed by assessments and a good awareness of literacy, numeracy, of these basic skills, and is aware of search functions like that, something that has both of those things combined, would be amazingly powerful. And I know that some of my researchers have been discussing ways of leveraging that county estimator that I showed you to help policymakers and practitioners think more specifically about the mechanisms that they should leverage to get messages out. So for example, the research suggests that if you're older or if you have low literacy, you're more likely to benefit from information on the radio or on TV. So this sort of information, like if that's a community and that's the demographics of the community, don't waste your time on building a whole bunch of fancy websites when really you should be getting your PSAs onto the radio or onto TV, right? So kind of thinking about how we make better informed decisions based on what we know about skills and some of these other things and how people seek information and how they process information, and people who optimize search tools to recognize the needs of a person and to help support them on their path towards finding information, whether that's putting information into different modes like radio or TV, or optimizing search tools to help guide people's path through a website. I think that's brilliant.